But let's update you on the latest COVID restrictions due to be lifted. Of course, England has already had its Freedom Day. Now Wales is set to have its Freedom Day set for tomorrow after months of following some of the UK's toughest restrictions, and the majority of COVID rules will be scrapped with a few exceptions.
Yes, at around midday today, the First Minister of Wales, Mark Drakeford, is expected to announce the relaxation of restrictions, but face masks will continue to be required in most indoor public places, including on public transport, in shops and in healthcare settings.
Yes, while speaking ahead of the announcement, the First Minister said this: alert level 0 does not mean the end of restrictions and a free-for-all. Even if you have been fully vaccinated, meeting outside is safer than inside. Let fresh air into indoor spaces, get tested, even for mild symptoms, and self-isolate when you are required to do so.
Well, we are now joined by Andrew RT Davies, leader of the opposition and Welsh Conservative leader. A very warm welcome to the programme. Look, this has been a long time coming. Cautious optimism about unlocking?
Well, good morning, both. Yes, very optimistic now that the vaccine programme has been so successful, and we can hopefully look at some of the restrictions that we've had to endure over the last 15 months from the rear-view mirror, rather than looking at us straight in the face every time we walk out the front door.
And some restrictions will stay in place. This is a very cautious reopening, and face masks, for example, will remain. I mean, what's your position on face masks? Because we know here in England they're not a legal requirement anymore, but certain train operators and other organisations are still very much expecting customers to wear them, and sometimes they are actually mandatory on some operators.
Well, I think the face mask coverings is a bit of a false avenue to go down, to be honest with you. The actual two big items still outstanding is really, should we need a Welsh public inquiry into how the COVID crisis was handled here in Wales, which regrettably the Labour First Minister is refusing to do, despite all the decisions being taken here in Wales needing that scrutiny. And secondly, we need to be keeping a close eye on the economy, because I think every man, woman and child is seeing inflationary pressures in their everyday lives now at the moment, just looking at fuel prices and the price of goods in stores. And from a government point of view, it's important that we keep on top of that, because we know if inflation starts to run riot, that will have big economic impacts on our daily lives.
Now, there's been a note of caution urging people not to go crazy as nightclubs and so forth are reopened from tomorrow in Wales. How hopeful are you that people will continue to be sensible? Or do you think, understandably, given what we've all been through, a lot of people might go a little bit crazy?
No, I think predominantly people will be sensible. There's always an element of society that whatever happens will always try and push the rules as far as they possibly can. But ultimately what we've all been through is a horrendous 15, 16 months, and it's collectively working together that we can make sure we don't have to go back into the restrictions. We do have to learn to live with COVID. There will be new variants because that's just the nature of viruses. But I go back to my earlier point. What's really important is that the decisions that were taken here in Wales are scrutinised by a Welsh independent public inquiry, and regrettably the Welsh Labour First Minister is refusing to do that. But today is a day of celebration because we are moving out of the restrictions that we've had to endure for the last 15, 16 months.
And which decisions are you most critical of? I mean, why is there this really pressing need to have this inquiry, as you say?
Well, I think if we just look at the death rate, regrettably in Wales, we have the highest death rate of any part of the United Kingdom because of COVID. And Welsh Government have been responsible for the health and social care restrictions and measures that have been put in place. And one of the mantras of the Welsh Labour Government here in Wales, they've been keeping Wales safe. Well, frankly, if you look, as I said, at the tragic death numbers that you look at from the Office of National Statistics, Wales, regrettably, as a proportion of the population, has the highest death rate of any part of the United Kingdom. So the measures that were put in place and the slogans that went with them from the Welsh Labour Government do need to be tested at an independent inquiry, so that people who have lost loved ones can have confidence that those measures have been tested thoroughly. And equally, we make sure that the measures that are put in place to deal with long COVID and any potential variants are strong enough to keep Wales protected.
It's interesting, isn't it? Because, a lot of people have said that the measures, the restrictions in Wales were too draconian, were more draconian than any other part of the UK. And yet, on the other hand, as you say, the death rate the highest there. So what would you have done differently? Would you have had less draconian measures? Or is it more that you want to check whether or not it was I think I remember vividly the supermarkets being covered up for non-essential items, and somebody somewhere was deciding that you couldn't buy notepaper or pens at one point during the pandemic because that wasn't considered essential. Things like that, is that what you object to?
Yeah, well, all parts of the United Kingdom had challenges, and all parts of the world have had challenges dealing with something that 18, 19 months ago, people wouldn't have had any comprehension about the existence of the COVID virus and how we might have to deal with that going forward. But what we do have seen in Wales is a miscommunication very often from the Welsh Government, such as non-essential retailers, that measures were brought in back in October, November of last year that led to so much confusion and led to those images that people saw on their TV screens of certain aisles being plastic barriers up to stop people going into them and buying goods that politicians were deeming were non-essential. And I do think that was an overreach of the government of the day at that particular time. But I go back to this point, which is a really important point, because it is something the First Minister's government are refusing to bring forward here in Wales, is that independent public inquiry, which is desperately needed. And rather than being a footnote in the UK public inquiry, which the UK government have confirmed, we need a Wales-wide inquiry to deal with the matters that we know have been done, the decisions that have been taken here in Wales. But today should be a day of celebration because thankfully we're getting most of the restrictions lifted, and let's celebrate the success of the vaccination programme.
And as you mentioned there, Wales has very much had a successful vaccination programme. One of the things the government here is trying to introduce is, of course, vaccine passports within a matter of months, if they have it their way, for clubs and large events. For instance, the list could get longer. We'll find out. I mean, what's your position on vaccine passports? Because, nobody wants to go back in another lockdown, particularly the people of Wales who have, as we say, had these, some might say, draconian measures enforced onto them. So vaccine passports may be a way to mitigate against that.
No, they won't be. I'm totally opposed to vaccine passports by stigmatising people and alienating people in our society. We're coming out of the COVID crisis. We need to come out as one country rather than stigmatising and victimising people who maybe through health considerations or other considerations haven't taken the vaccine. We have had a successful vaccine rollout that is due to the early procurement of the vaccine doses that were required, and above all, the population at large deciding to come forward and be vaccinated. Let's celebrate that fact, but let's not blight the vaccine programme by coming out and insisting on vaccine passports. And this is one area where the First Minister of Wales and myself are in complete agreement, because I pressed him on this in First Minister's questions, and he agrees with me that vaccine passports would be a backward step.
One of the reasons I think that Prime Minister Boris Johnson decided to do the U-turn on vaccine passports was because overnight, virtually in France, when these were introduced, they saw the uptake swell enormously, particularly amongst young people, in order to boost numbers taking up the vaccine. So if it does work as an incentive to get the young people vaccinated, which is where we know that the virus is circulating at the moment, perhaps, you could see yourself agreeing with Prime Minister Boris Johnson on this, who himself is naturally libertarian, anti-passport vaccines, anti the idea of something leading to ID cards in the future. It's sort of being a policy and ideology sort of pass on this occasion in order to try and boost the uptake of the vaccine.
Well, thankfully, we've had record numbers of people coming forward to take up the vaccine. That's why we've had such strong vaccine numbers. But I draw your attention to the fact in France, they were actually on about dismissing people from having jobs if they didn't have a vaccine. We're better than that as a country, I have to say. We don't need to deploy such threats that Macron did. He's facing re-election next year, and he had a disastrous start to his vaccination programme, as did the bulk of Europe have a disastrous start to their vaccination programme. Let's build on the success we've had. Let's not stigmatise and isolate people in our society, and let's make sure that we don't have to have the restrictions that hopefully we're seeing lifted today, confirmed by the First Minister at midday, here in Wales, but across the United Kingdom. It's been a horrendous 15, 16 months. We should also reflect on those who tragically have lost their lives. And let's build a better country and not go back to the dark days of having some sort of passport identification documents, because Wales and the United Kingdom isn't about that type of regulation.
Well, Andrew, RT Davies, thank you so much for joining us this morning. We, of course, as we say, we will await to hear what Mark Drakeford says at around midday. But before then, we're now joined by our Wales reporter, Lily Hewitson, who can tell us what we might expect to hear from the First Minister when he makes that announcement later. Lily, what restrictions do we know or do we expect him to be announcing to lift, and which ones will be staying in place?
Hiya, Mercy and Isabel. Yes, that is the case. It was announced last night that Wales will enter into alert level 0 from Saturday morning. And as you've been discussing this morning, you know, for me, it felt like something perhaps we'd never see coming. This day never felt like it was coming, but it is. So from Saturday, things are all change. And the First Minister will be addressing that in his press conference at 12:30 this afternoon. So the main things that we're going to see changing is that all restrictions on meeting people will be lifted. So whether that be in a public setting, you know, perhaps you're going to the pub or an event, maybe a funeral or a wedding, and within the private home, you'll be able to see and meet as many people as you want, which is a major change here in Wales. Also, all businesses will be able to reopen. There's certainly a focus on those nightclubs and those indoor attractions that have been closed for, you know, the best part of 17 months now. They'll be able to reopen from Saturday as well. But of course, as you say, there are those important precautions, if you like, and they're going to remain in place here in Wales over the summer months to ensure that cases remain in decline, which they have been for the last 3 weeks since the First Minister held his last press conference. So you're going to have to continue to self-isolate if you do have symptoms of COVID for 10 days. Face coverings also are going to remain in place in some settings. So in those public settings like shops, on public transport and in health and social care settings, you will still have to wear a face mask. But you won't have to wear one if you're, you know, going to a pub or if you're going to a restaurant. So, you know, later on today we will get some more details into the specifics of that. There'll be some settings you have to wear one and some settings where you won't. Businesses who are open to the public as well will be able to kind of do their own risk assessment to see how many people they can have in their environment. If they want to put any COVID restrictions in place, they can. So the Welsh Government are kind of handing over the baton from themselves over to the businesses to kind of make those decisions for their own, depending on, you know, every business is unique, so some of them might need restrictions, some of them might not. But there is still that air of caution around the First Minister's announcement. You know, he said that it's not going to be a free-for-all, and he's used this word caution throughout. So we'll find out some more details from about 12:30. So as you say, from 6 a.m. on Saturday, no legal limits on the number of people who can meet, wherever that be. Nightclubs reopening, so, you know, great for students here in Cardiff, in Aberystwyth, in those, you know, major student cities. You know, the clubs are going to be open when you come back to uni, which is major. And workplaces will be able to have more flexibility. So, you know, at the moment there might only be a couple members of staff who can go into the office, but from Saturday they'll be able to make those changes. And of course, face coverings are not going to be a legal requirement, but they will be necessary in those certain public settings. And of course, from Saturday, fully vaccinated adults and those under the age of 18 will not have to self-isolate if they do come into contact with somebody who has had COVID. So lots of changes, good news for a lot of people and businesses across Wales.
Welcome to the GB News YouTube channel. You can watch us live 24 hours a day, catch up on your favourite shows and join in the conversation in the comments below.
Don't forget to subscribe and you'll never miss any of our exclusive content.